Right, greetings, hello. It's Dr. Thomas Daffern here for my weekly Fasting Sunday talk, address. I thought I'd do it from a different room in the Museum of the Muses here. I'm now in Thalia, which is one of the guest rooms, and this room is devoted to literature. You'll see around me a huge collection of books on literature. I have here the poetry, drama, novels, dictionaries, philology, linguistics, language studies, essays and so on, critical essays. So this is the room in the museum here of the Muses dedicated to Thalia. And Thalia is not the least of muses. Obviously literature is just, where would the world be without literature, eh? And from quite an early age, I decided I wanted to be a poet. I discovered poetry in my family's library. My mother was a literary scholar herself in French and Latin and English. She had a big library. My father loved literature as well. And I was brought up to appreciate the sounds of literature. We were, as a family, we used to read poetry and plays together. And before, by the time of my teens, I'd started writing. I loved English at school. I was quite good at it, always got top marks, and I had some very good teachers. And I find language a miracle. The fact that I can speak to you and you can understand. I've never fallen out of love with that miracle ever since childhood. I have quite early memories of consciousness. Growing up in Montreal as a baby and a little boy, I remember being conscious before I could speak. It's just a fact. I can remember the look of snow. I can remember the taste of snow in your mouth as a baby, even. Young child playing in the snow in Canada, in Montreal. I don't think I had language then, so consciousness is not the same as language, to me. Experientially, I can just say this. Consciousness is a sense of being. It's the psyche. It's the self. Language then gets added, and of course, it's added by one's parents and one's siblings. I had an elder brother and sister, and then it's added by, you go to school, you go to kindergarten or whatever. And then you learn literacy, you learn writing and the alphabet. And I still remember the amazed wonder of all that. And I've never fallen out of love with language. But I think the key thing is the consciousness behind the language. It's when you're reading a great poem or listening to, a piece of drama or reading a novel, it's the thinking behind it that is the important thing. And when your subjective consciousness can then link into that person's subjective consciousness, that's the miracle. There's a saying in Anglo-Saxon, good wits do jump. And I have it pinned on the wall of one of the rooms here in the museum. Good wits jump. I mean, in Anglo-Saxon, wit meant intelligence, consciousness, mind. The Witan was the place of assembly of the realm where the elders met. It's the ancestor of Parliament, the Witan. And good wits do jump. And that's why I bother with these talks. That's why I bothered becoming a teacher, an educator, because I believe we have essential goodness in our souls. We're born with it. Our education systems, our social institutions should enhance and augment that, not diminish it. And this is the struggle of culture, the struggle of education and philosophy. Each generation has to do its best not to slip below the moral and intellectual accomplishments of the previous generation, and if possible to then advance a little bit. It's like we're climbing up this great wall of time as mountaineers, and we have to, each generation has to go on a little further. And that requires dedication to learning what the previous generations have done. That's why I spent a lot of my youth listening and learning from older people. because the elders are to be respected and learned from. And then you try and go a little further, you know. And my parents were amazing, good people, and I was honoured to be their child. And their friends, their circle of friends, these are people that survived the war, World War II, and had a tremendous optimism and faith in humanity as a result. They'd seen the bestiality of man, what we're capable of, the horrors of ignorance. And they knew that sometimes you have to stand up against it and marshal your inner spiritual and intellectual and material resources to defeat ignorance. And it was awesome to meet that generation and to learn from them. And then I went and nursed in Canada with elders who'd actually fought in these battles, D-Day and coming up Italy, and you know, I heard all their war stories, and it was extraordinary. I made a vow that should never have to happen again. My generation, I think, should be dedicated to preventing World War III. That's been my mission since I can remember, since consciousness. You know, it's like, how on earth did this Holocaust happen? Why did all these people get gassed and killed? And why did these mass bombings take place? You know, we must stop this. And so I turned to literature as a poet, as one of the vehicles. I'm also a philosopher, as you know, and a historian, and you know, a specialist in science and medicine and history of ideas, you know, etc., etc. But those I'm leaving for other rooms. This is the room of literature, and I'm speaking to you today as a poet and as a novelist. I published one novel so far. I'm writing a second one as we speak, and you know, I believe my work in literature is what it's been is an attempt to hand on that torch of gnosis, that future generations don't have to repeat mistakes of previous generations. And yet I watched in horror as we've had Balkan wars, we've had wars in the Middle East, in Iraq, you know, the Iraq invasions, 9/11, and the whole chaos and meltdown in Afghanistan and Libya. And as a poet, I've been watching, and as a philosopher and historian, you know, in shock. Like, how can we be doing this all over again? Why aren't we helping these poor people to find peace? Why can't we help solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which has just dragged on and on and on and on? I've visited a lot of these countries, I've met people. Nobody wants these conflicts to be going on. So then, as a academic, I've made it my life's purpose to find out who's responsible, you know, what's going on here, and to then call them out and prevent it. You know, the military-industrial complex is very, very sinister, in my opinion, has very far-reaching, influence in Britain, in America particularly, but in Russia, in China, in France even. And obviously there are vested interests that don't want to be called out. And in Israel as well, Israel has got one of the most powerful armies, you know, in the Middle East, and even judged on world standards. What I've noticed is where these military concentrations of power occur, truth becomes sacrificed, and you know, lying becomes standard because it then protects the elite who own and operate and justify their moral barbarism and warfare. I mean, the tragedy of Israel and Palestine is that after World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, you know, we thought that little Israel would become a good team player in the world community, and to begin with, she was. And I have dear Israeli friends, and yet, is it really beyond their intelligence to work out how to make a peace deal with the Palestinians, their neighbours, their cousins, the people that they're like just over the, you know, a few miles from? So one watches in horror as these inabilities arise. So for me, poetry, you see, poetry is an attempt to express the inexplicable. All literature is. And that's why it's a tool in the craft, you know, repertoire of peacemakers. All peacemakers should be poets, and many of them are. Many of my friends active in peace research, peace studies, teachers, professors, and so on, they are also poets. And long may we flourish. it was my privilege in the 1990s, to be invited to the Struga Poetry Festival in Macedonia, Northern Macedonia, and I went and met poets from all over the world, incredible people, some of them very famous, and set up an order of wandering peace poets, which I'm still running from this museum. So if you're a poet, if you believe in the power of poetry, if you believe in the power of literature, let's work together. Okay, I'm gonna. This talk is not going to be just a talk. It's different. It's going to be a series of readings. I have a series of readings selected, and I'm going to intersperse them with a few comments, but mostly it's just readings. I want you to sit back and enjoy the literature, really, because it's, important stuff. It's literature, right? So I'm going to start with a reading from one of my first early poems, just so that you get the flavour. I mean, I wrote this poem way back in 1972 in my teens. And it's very short. It gives you a flavour of what I was trying to do at that time in my first poetic works. It's called Sonata for Beethoven. I grew up surrounded by classical music. I am a musician. I play and I can compose and improvise, and Beethoven is one of my favourites. It's called Sonata for Beethoven. Gently, the rain is a soft tune. Only a few falling. Pianissimo. So one hardly notices at all. Gently, the rain is a soft tune, while we step gently, as impressions only, with the quality of air besmirched by rain. Gently, the rain is a soft tune, a spell, unbroken. Yet do not take lightly gentleness, or these few falls, for the sound that comes to us, the soft padding, is one of footfall on the floor above, where no one has been known to live for years. I'm going to finish that. I'm going to follow that with a poem by a poet that influenced me and I was inspired by as a young, teenage poet setting out. And this is a great Polish poet, Zbiegnew Herbert. This poem is called Why the Classics? In the fourth book of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides tells, among other things, the story of his unsuccessful expedition. Among long speeches of chiefs, battle sieges, plague, dense nets of intrigues and diplomatic endeavours, the episode is like a pin in a forest. The Greek colony Amphipolis fell into the hands of Brasidos because Thucydides was late with relief. For this, he paid his native city with lifelong exile. Exiles of all times know what price that is. Generals of the most recent wars, if a similar affair happens to them, whine on their knees before posterity, praise their heroism and innocence. They accuse their subordinates, envious colleagues, unfavourable winds. Thucydides says only that he had 7 ships. It was winter, and he sailed quickly. If art, for its subject, will have a broken jar, a small broken soul, with a great self-pity, what will remain after us will be like lovers weeping in a small dirty hotel when wallpaper dawns. What will happen when hands fall away from poems? When in the other mountains I drink dry water? This should not matter, but it does. What will poems become when the breath departs and the grace of speaking is rejected? Will I leave the table and descend into the valley where there resounds new laughter by a dark forest? I want to read now two interconnected pieces. One is from a sermon by John Donne, who another poet that inspired me and still does, one of the great English language poets. But he also was a great writer of sermons, and he became a vicar in his later years and Dean of St Paul's in London. I used to live near Montgomery in Powys in Wales, and John Donne was a frequent visitor to the castle of Montgomery, where the Herbert family lived. Sir Edward Herbert was the owner of the castle, and his mother, Magdalen Herbert, was a dear friend of John Donne. And in fact, Magdalen is buried in the churchyard in Montgomery, which is a beautiful old Georgian town now. The castle was pulled down by Parliament, but it's still there, the ruins, you can wander about. And I often used to go there in the evenings for an evening walk, because I lived literally just a little ways from it. And I would often think about John Donne. And this is one of his sermons, given at St Paul's on January the 25th in 1628. Alas, we, men of this world, worms of this dunghill, whether basilisks or blind worms, whether scarabs or silkworms, whether high or low in the world, have no minds to change. The Platonic philosophers did not only acknowledge animam in homine, a soul in man, but mentem in anima, a mind in the soul. They meant by the mind the superior faculties of the soul. And we never come to exercise them. Men and women call one another inconstant and accuse one another of having changed their minds, when, God knows, they have but changed the object of their eye and seen a better white or red. An old man loves not the same sports that he did when he was young, nor a sick man the same meats that he did when he was well. But these men have not changed their minds. The old man hath changed his fancy, and the sick man his taste, neither his mind. Poor intricated soul, riddling, perplexed, labyrinthical soul, thou couldst not say that thou believest not in God if there were no God. Thou couldst not believe in God if there were no God. If there were no God, thou couldst not speak. Thou couldst not think. Not a word, not a thought, No, not against God. Thou couldst not blaspheme the name of God. Thou couldst not swear if there were no God. For all thy faculties, however depraved and perverted be they, are from him. And except thou canst seriously believe that thou art nothing, thou canst not believe that there is no God. To ask thee then, is there a God now? I respite thee, but a few hours, but 6 hours, but till midnight. Wake then, and then dark and alone. Hear God ask thee then. Remember that I ask thee now. Is there a God? And if thou darest, say no. I think this is a beautiful sermon. I haven't read the complete text. I love what he's saying about, we don't exercise our minds. The mind is deep in the soul of man. We don't often actually actualize our use of it. And this is what I call, what philosophers call intellect, or nous in the Greek. And it's why I bother with the World Intellectual Forum and my other work as a teacher and scholar. And it's why I'm so disheartened at the level of the debate over Brexit, which is a non-debate. It's a complete hijacking of Britain's soul, and a soporific poison has been applied to the mind in our souls. Anyone with the slightest degree of intelligence would know that Brexit was a catastrophe and should have been reversed, or should not have been implemented. The referendum was not anything more than advisory. I'd met Theresa May and I was appalled at her lack of intelligence at implementing a full-on Brexit, as if that's what the people had voted for when they hadn't. I thought she was reasonably intelligent. I was appalled, and that's why I began these weekly fasts against that catastrophe. But what I've realised, it's what I'm fasting actually is against Sophiaphobia, against ignorance, against this lack of actualising the mind in our souls, and the lack of our intellectual work that we should be doing as Homo sapiens. This was John Donne's point. Otherwise, why bother to get up and do a sermon like that? Okay, I want to move on and quote from one of his masters and one of my masters, Plato, the great Greek philosopher. Remember what he said about the mind and the soul. This is from Plato's Timaeus. And it's from a wonderful Greek reader, edited by W.H. Auden, great British poet. Concerning the soul, as to which part is mortal and which divine, and how and why they are separated, and where located, if God acknowledges that we have spoken the truth, then and then only can we be confident. Still, we may venture to assert that what has been said by us is probable, and will be rendered more probable by investigation. Let us assume thus much. What I love about Plato is his moderation and his scientific approach to the mysteries of psychology. Plato was a believer in the mind and the soul, and Christian Neoplatonism, which is what John Donne was in the tradition of, and which inspired me when I later studied these matters. In my teens, I just wanted to be a poet. I studied poetry, and I found a voice within myself from I don't know where. I would now say from the mind and the soul, from the heart, which is another word for this. Later, when I studied philosophy and went to university and studied for many years and ended up teaching, I understood, the language, and when I read the entire works of Plato in Canada in my early 20s, it was, it was like a light going off. It was meeting old friends. Anyway, a little glimpse of Plato. I want to read again from round about the time of John Donne, a little passage from Shakespeare. When I was a teenager, I used to act, and as well as writing, and I acted in several Shakespeare plays. I used to love the stage, the whole adventure of it, and I was told I could be an actor when I grew up. Who knows? Maybe when I grow up, I'll still become an actor. For now, I've written plays, and there's still a couple that I'd like to see performed. Shakespeare inspired me a great deal. His language, his thought, his rhythms. He's called the Bard of Britain, and not in vain. My father was from Warwick, which is close to Stratford-on-Avon, and I think George, my father, instilled in me a great love of Shakespeare. And we used to read on Sunday afternoons as a family when I was, a youth, excerpts from Shakespeare's plays. So I'm going to read a very short excerpt from one of my favourite plays, Antony and Cleopatra. It's a masterpiece and it's a tragedy and a love story and a cosmic drama. This is from Act 4. It's an extraordinary passage, and Antony, who's lost his battle, is meeting Eros, like the spirit of Eros, the spirit of love, like a god, really. He's going slightly mad, is the implication. Antony: Eros, thou yet beholdst me? Eros: I, noble lord. Antony: sometime we see a cloud that's dragonish, a vapour sometime, like a bear or lion, a towered citadel, a pendant rock, a forked mountain or blue promontory, with trees upon't, that nod unto the world, and mock our eyes with air. Thou hast seen these signs. They are black Vespers pageants. Ay, my lord. That which is now a horse, even with a thought, the rack disclims and makes it indistinct, as water is in water. Eros: it does, my lord. Antony: my good knave Eros, now thy captain is even such a body. Here I am Antony, yet I cannot hold this visible shape, my knave. I made these wars for Egypt, and the queen, whose heart I thought I had, for she had mine, which, whilst it was mine, had annexed unto it 1,000,000 more, now lost. She, Eros, has packed cards with Caesar, and false played my glory unto an enemy's triumph. Nay, weep not, gentle Eros. There is left ourselves to end ourselves. It's a dramatic moment, and it's just before Antony is going to commit suicide. The story of Antony and Cleopatra is very interesting from a literary point of view. They were both learned people. Cleopatra especially was highly literate. She was multilingual, versed in literature. She would have known Plato's works, in great detail. And she was a descendant of Alexander the Great and the Macedonian royal family. And Antony was from a sort of reasonably well-to-do Roman family and had a love of literature, nothing like Cleopatra's. But he knew how much she loved literature, and as a present, he transshipped from Pergamon in Anatolia, or Asia Minor, the second greatest library in the ancient world. It's unbelievable. He moved all the codices, they were scrolls in those days, to Alexandria by ship. None of them were lost. And augmented the Library of Alexandria, the famous Library of Alexandria, with this present. It was a wedding present to Cleopatra. I think personally it was a tragedy, because not long after, the Library of Alexandria then did catch fire, and eventually it was destroyed. If he'd kept the books in Pergamon, maybe they would have survived. You know, it's a thought. And what treasures we lost when Alexandria Library went up in flames, you know, is incalculable. So anyway, Shakespeare was a great lover of the classics and a great lover of Europe, a great lover of Italy. He sets a lot of his plays in Italy, Romeo and Juliet of course, but many others. And it's now thought that he travelled widely in Europe. He came to France, scholars have discovered, and he also went to Italy, because in the English College at Rome, his signature is given, which is where English visiting writers, scholars, savants would stay, which also indicates that he was brought up by his father in Stratford as a Catholic, which is, you know, very probable, because his father was actually named to have been. And in the house in Stratford where the Shakespeare family lived, they found some Catholic texts hidden up in the eaves, which meant that's why Shakespeare was such a universalist thinker and interested in, you know, the overview, the bigger picture. That's why he loved, you know, the wider view. I'm just going to read briefly a little excerpt from a famous book, Shakespeare the Thinker, by A.D. Nuttall, because literary criticism is also important, and it's also in this room. And Shakespeare was a thinker. He just puts it into his drama. Usually, Shakespeare steers clear of theology, but in The Merchant of Venice, a breach is made, and theology streams in. In Measure for Measure, the stream becomes a flood. Isabella, with a wonderful hesitancy, as at a truth too shaming, too glorious to be put into words, reminds Angelo of Christ's merciful atonement. Why, all the souls that were forfeit once, and he that might the vantage best have took, found out the remedy. It will be said that there is nothing Gnostic about this. Isabella is offering Angelo a beautiful healing, reconciling thought. I answer yes, but Isabella is not the only person in the play. We've already seen how she does not have uncontested ethical sway over the drama in which she figures. When Portia makes her splendid speech about the quality of mercy in The Merchant of Venice, it appears to carry all before it, to be indeed absolutely higher than the retributive justice of the old law, of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a